Justin Gaethje delivered a candidate for Knockout of the Year with this head kick to defeat Dustin Poirier. And in this video, we're going to take a look at the knockout anatomy and science to better understand the functional level of how he did this. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer. My goal in this channel is to help teach you about the medical side of the sports world. Starting at the basics here, the first thing to know is that anytime an unexpected shot gets delivered, the athlete who receives that shot, in this case Dustin Poirier, is not going to anticipate it coming, and so they can't contract the muscles around their neck to try and limit how much movement is coming into the head and ultimately to the brain. These concussions, these knockouts happen because of this quick, sudden movement in the skull that gets transmitted into the brain. So the first thing that we see in this whole sequence, of course, is this right coming in from Gaethje. The first thing that does is it sets that establishment that Poirier is not going to be ready for the kick that's ultimately coming. So before we even get into any of the physics and sort of the rotational mechanics here and the anatomy of what Gaethje does with this kick, he's already starting at an advantage because Poirier is not ready for what's coming. His neck is not ready to contract and try and protect his head from excessively moving as this kick ultimately gets ready to come in from Gaethje. That sudden movement to the head is demonstrated right here. We can see as that kick lands, in one frame, Poirier's head is essentially stationary. The brain is stationary. The brain sitting inside the cerebral spinal fluid is static. It's not moving around. But then as this kick comes in, all of a sudden in just a couple of frames here, we see this sudden movement in Poirier's skull, which is eventually going to catch up to where his brain is going to violently move inside the skull and ultimately cause that alteration in consciousness that affects his equilibrium, affects him, and leads to him falling down and ultimately Gaethje getting the knockout. And you can also see that Poirier's eyes are closed. When your eyes are closed, you don't have that visual feedback of what's coming in to then tell your muscles around your neck to stabilize the head, stabilize the skull, to try to limit this quick, abrupt movement that we see, because ultimately this abrupt movement, the skull moves first, the brain is then going to catch up to the skull, hit against the inside of the skull, move around violently, and that triggers the cascade of events inside the brain that ultimately lead to the knockout. So from the very beginning of this move, Poirier is at a disadvantage because his brain is not able to process what's about to come in, and he's not able to guard and protect himself. The next thing that we see from Gaethje is this balance that he demonstrates. If we think of his body's sort of center of gravity going straight down through here, everything that happens from the start of this kick coming up happens in synchrony between his left arm and his right leg. So down here, as we start to see his right hip come forward into this hip flexion, activating likely his quadricep muscle with the rectus femoris, his iliopsoas, his hip flexor, starting to swing that leg forward, that hip forward into hip flexion. We also see his left arm rotate upwards into this abducted position. So abduction is when the body moves something away from the midline. So in this case, up away. As we go reverse, this coming down is going to be a deduction. So Gaethje, bringing his left arm up as his right hip swings forward, maintains this sense of balance on both sides of his line of equilibrium. That balance is extremely important because this whole system is going to be rotating. Remember that Gaethje's leg is going to be swinging around and rotating about this axis. And so you want to have that axis balanced on both sides as best you can, with weight on one side, weight on the other, moving in synchrony to ultimately be able to deliver the most energy kick at the terminal point of where that contact is coming. And so the fact that we see this perfect synchronous motion, as soon as Gaethje's hip starts to flex forward, we see his left arm come out, he maintains that perfect balance. You can almost even see down to his left leg, how his left leg is perfectly in line with ultimately where he's fixated on his target for Poirier. And so that's all about physics. That's all about that rotational balance in that system that's maintained as he starts to flex that hip up. I mean, it's so perfect how it happens at just the exact time in perfect sequence to maintain his balance and ultimately deliver that kick right on target. Before we talk about the other muscles and movements with Gaethje's kick, we mentioned Poirier's eyes being closed and his inability to perceive what was coming in, therefore his inability to fire his neck muscles, contract, and guard against the knockout. Look at what Gaethje's eyes are doing. Gaethje's eyes are focused this entire time directly on his target. He's looking right at that spot where he's ultimately trying to deliver that kick. What this does is it allows his brain to have this motor planning. So there's a part of your brain that controls muscles, that controls your motor. It's your primary motor cortex, the motor strip. But there's also then a part of the brain that controls motor planning. It's the part of the brain that's interpreting all these positions in space, your proprioception, your visual target, and then has that ability to plan out where you need to move your limbs in space to ultimately go to where you want to be. Right from the start of when Gaethje's right leg is still down here on the ground, we can see how his eyes are already focused on his target. And so his brain has to be able to process the visual input of where Poirier is located, feed that to his motor cortex, feed that down his spinal cord into his muscles to get his leg from this position all the way up to make that kick. And at each stage along the way, his body is able to perceive where his joints are relative in space and ultimately deliver that target with that motor planning. In Gaethje's left leg, it's primarily a lot of isometric contraction of his muscle. There's not a lot of movement. Now, isometric, iso means unchanged, metric length. And so isometric contractions are when the muscles are firing, but not necessarily changing length a lot. Now, Gaethje does explode up a little bit, so he goes into a little bit of knee extension to sort of help elevate his foot off the ground up to its target, but for the most part, his left leg stays pretty stationary. Now, the muscles are still having to fire. His muscles in the front, his quadriceps, his hamstrings in the back, his glute muscles, his calf and soleus down the lower leg are primarily going to be isometrically contracting to maintain that rigid pivot point that we talked about early on for his body to ultimately rotate about that center position. Now, the muscles and the actions to actually get this kick to come through and to move his leg, a few things that we got to look at here. Number one, we're going to see some rotation of his trunk. The muscles that help to rotate your trunk are going to be the obliques, the internal obliques and the external obliques. The internal obliques are the same side rotators. So for example, my right internal obliques are going to fire to bring my left shoulder down towards my right hip. The external obliques do the opposite. In this case, Gaethje's right hip is coming over towards his left shoulder, so his internal obliques are going to be firing on this left side, and his external obliques are going to be firing on the right to allow his trunk to complete this rotation. His trunk rotates initially, and then it's his leg that catches up to that trunk rotation, swinging through here, a little bit of hip flexion. His knee in this position is going to be flexed as well, and so of course the knee has to then be extended. Quadriceps muscles are going to be the extensors of the knee. They are firing here. His knee is still flexed. He gets up in, again, this nicely balanced position. And then ultimately we're going to see the knee extensors fire to straighten out that leg and then, of course, deliver that kick. The final thing in the kick from Gaethje's perspective that's really important is that once the contact is delivered, you have to tension the muscles in that lower limb, or else his leg is just going to get knocked backwards into flexion when it hits Poirier. You can tell how whenever that kick comes through and lands, there's no real additional movement. Basically, it just stops and stays pretty much at the extension and flexion angle that it's at. It doesn't bounce back in this way right away. If Gaethje kicks and his muscles aren't contracted in his leg, the leg is loose. The leg can't deliver that energy. And so you have to be able, same with a punch, be loose and kind of like a whip. You're loose until you get out there, and then as the impact comes, you flex the muscles, you contract so that it can be stable to deliver the blow. Gaethje has to contract his muscles in his leg as the kick comes in, because otherwise it would be unstable and Poirier would just deflect it backwards and it wouldn't do any damage. And of course, another view here, we can see where Poirier unfortunately still has his eyes closed again. That part, what we talked about at the very beginning, where he has no idea when this impact is going to come. His brain is not able to interpret and get that visual input of knowing when to try and contract his muscles around his neck to try and protect his head and ultimately his brain. And that was all set up because of this right that came in from Gaethje. The last thing I want to talk about here is just something to keep an eye out for Poirier, because we've talked through the kick, but then we also need to talk about the damage on the other end. The kick from Gaethje lands not really on Poirier's head at all. It lands really on the backside of his neck and potentially in an area at the base of the skull. So the base of the skull is going to run kind of around maybe this area, and then you're going to have spinal column starting right about there. There's a bony prominence on the backside of the ear called the mastoid process that continues on down towards the base of the skull. You know we got to bring in our biodigital anatomy tool at least one time, and so here if we look on the side of the skull, we can see this little prominence right here is going to be that mastoid process. The ear is sitting right about in this area, and so this is that bump that we see and we can feel on the backside of our ear. But all this then down here is going to be the base of the skull. There's something that we can see on physical exam called a battle sign. A battle sign is whenever somebody has bruising or ecchymosis on the backside of their ear near that mastoid process. And this can be highly suggestive of a fracture at the base of the skull. And a basilar skull fracture is a very serious thing to watch out for. And so that'll be something important for Poirier, is if he develops any bruising on this backside. Yes, he got kicked there, but also you need to have a high index of suspicion for a basal skull fracture. So that's it for the video. I hope this is still interesting to just kind of walk through what I'm seeing from a functional anatomy, sort of physics, more scientific perspective on what we notice with things like balance, muscle actions, muscle contraction positions, and just other anatomic aspects of these knockouts. Let me know as always any questions or comments down below, and until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.